You lived years of your life, formed memories, felt everything, and your brain erased it all on purpose. You lived an entire life before the age of 3, not fragments, not vague impressions, a full life. You opened your eyes for the first time and didn't understand what sight even was. You heard voices before you knew what language meant. You felt comfort, fear, hunger, warmth. You learned how to move, how to reach, how to recognize the people who would shape everything about you. And yet, it's all gone, no images, no scenes, no memories you can return to. I used to accept that without thinking too much about it. The usual explanation sounds reasonable enough. Your brain wasn't developed yet. You were too young to remember. But the more I sat with that idea, the more it started to fall apart. Because when you really think about it, those years weren't empty. They were some of the most intense, information-rich, life-defining moments you ever experienced. You weren't passive. You were learning faster than you ever would again. So how does a brain capable of learning that much remember nothing? That's the part that kept bothering me. And what I found is that the problem isn't what most people think. Your brain wasn't failing back then. It wasn't blank, and it wasn't inactive. It was recording everything. There's even a name for this phenomenon, first introduced by Sigmund Freud in 1905, infantile amnesia. The idea that every human being carries a kind of built-in blackout over the earliest years of life. But Freud couldn't explain why it happens, and today, we're starting to realize something much stranger. Your earliest memories didn't disappear because they were never formed. They disappeared because something happened to them after, and once you see what that something is, it forces you to rethink not just memory, but who you are. Because if your brain was already capturing your life back then what exactly erased it? To even begin answering that, we have to look at what your mind was actually capable of in those first months of life. One experiment kept coming back to me because of how simple it is, and how unsettling its implications are. A researcher tied a ribbon from a baby's ankle to a mobile hanging above a crib. When the baby kicked, the mobile moved. At first, it was random. Then something shifted, the kicking became intentional, cause and effect had been discovered. But what stayed with me wasn't the learning, it was what happened later. When those same babies were brought back days after the experiment, they didn't start from zero. They kicked immediately, as if they remembered the connection. Even at 2 months old, they could hold on to that memory for a short time. By 6 months, that window stretched to weeks. So I had to confront something I wasn't expecting. The system was already working. Not perfectly, not fully developed, but undeniably functional. Babies could encode experiences, they could store them, they could retrieve them. Which makes the silence of our early years feel even louder. If memory exists that early, why doesn't any of it survive? The answer, at least partially, sits deep in the architecture of the brain. The hippocampus, the structure responsible for turning experience into memory, is present from early on. But it doesn't operate in isolation. In adults, it relies on a network, especially the prefrontal cortex, to stabilize and organize those experiences into something lasting. In infancy, that network is still under construction. Critical pathways are incomplete. Regions like the dentate gyrus, which help filter and solidify new memories, aren't fully functional until later in childhood. So what you had wasn't a broken system, it was an unfinished one. Capable of capturing moments, but not yet capable of preserving them. And still, that explanation feels incomplete, like we're only seeing the surface of something much deeper. And that's where the explanation takes a turn that I honestly didn't expect. Because for a long time, I thought the problem was simply that the brain couldn't hold onto memories yet. But what if that's not what was happening at all? What if the real reason those memories disappeared is because your brain was changing too fast to keep them? There's a process called neurogenesis, the creation of new neurons. It happens throughout life, but in your earliest years, it happens at a rate that's almost hard to imagine. Your brain isn't just learning, it's rebuilding itself, constantly adding new cells, forming new pathways, reshaping its own structure. At first, that sounds like progress, growth, something purely positive. But then I came across a series of experiments that made me pause. Researchers found that when they increased neurogenesis in adult mice, those mice actually became worse at remembering things they had already learned. And when they slowed neurogenesis in young mice, those mice held onto memories longer than expected. That flips the entire idea of memory on its head. It suggests that the act of building the brain can interfere with the act of remembering. Because every time a new neuron is integrated into an existing network, it doesn't just add something new. It shifts the entire pattern. It changes how connections are wired. And in doing so, it can disrupt the fragile structures that were holding a memory in place. When I try to picture that, I don't see a stable storage system. I see a space under constant construction, where walls are being moved, rooms are being rebuilt, and anything left inside can be lost in the process. Your early memories didn't slowly fade away, they were overwritten. Not because your brain failed, but because it was too busy becoming something more complex to preserve what came before. But even that isn't the strangest part, because memory isn't just about storing events, it's about knowing that those events happened to you. And that's where I had to confront something much more uncomfortable. At some point in early development, there is no stable you in the way you experience yourself now. There is perception, reaction, emotion, but not a clear sense of being a separate individual observing it all. Psychologists have shown this in a surprisingly simple way. If you place a small mark on a baby's face and let them look into a mirror, younger infants don't recognize the reflection as themselves. They treat it like another child. Only later, somewhere around 18 to 24 months, do they reach for the mark on their own face. That moment marks something profound, the emergence of self-recognition. Before that shift, experiences are not organized around a central identity. There is no internal narrator saying, "This happened to me." And without that anchor, memories don't form in the way we usually think of them. They don't become stories. They don't belong to anyone. When I think about that, it reframes the entire problem. It's not just that early memories were unstable or overwritten. It's that they may never have been personal to begin with. And then there's language. Before you had words, your experiences were raw. Sounds, textures, light, emotions, all passing through without structure. Language doesn't just describe those experiences later, it organizes them. It gives them a shape that can be stored and revisited. Once children begin to speak, and especially once they start talking about the past with others, something changes. Memories become more durable, more coherent, more accessible. What's even more fascinating is that this process isn't identical for everyone. Cultural differences in how families talk about the past can shift how early those lasting memories begin. Which means memory isn't just built in the brain, it's built through the way we learn to understand ourselves. And when you step back and let all of that settle, the answer stops feeling like a single explanation and starts feeling like a convergence. It wasn't just that your brain couldn't store memories yet. It wasn't just that it was rewriting itself at an incredible speed. It wasn't just that there was no stable sense of self, or that language hadn't arrived to organize your experiences. It was all of it, happening at once. Your earliest years weren't empty. They were overloaded, unstable, constantly shifting. A system trying to build itself, while simultaneously trying to record what it was experiencing. And in that tension, something had to give. What gave was permanence. The more I think about it, the less this feels like forgetting, and the more it feels like transformation. Those early experiences didn't simply vanish. They were absorbed into the structure that replaced them. They became part of the wiring, even if they're no longer accessible as memories you can revisit. But that leads me to a question I can't quite shake. If the brain that lived those moments has been physically and functionally reshaped, if the connections that held those experiences have been dismantled and rebuilt into something else, then what exactly connects you to that earlier version? Is it continuity of the body, of biology, or something less tangible? When you look at a photo of yourself as a baby, it feels obvious that it's you. But if you strip away memory, strip away identity, strip away the structure that makes your experiences feel like they belong to a single, continuous person, that certainty starts to weaken. Maybe not completely, but enough to make you pause, and maybe that's the real answer hidden underneath all of this. Your brain didn't fail to remember your early life, it chose, in a sense, not to preserve it. Because what it was building required something more important than memory, it required change. It required letting go of what came before so something more stable, more complex, and more aware could take its place. In other words, you didn't just forget who you were, you became someone else.